Hello makers, and welcome to my new series, Clay Basics. In today's episode, episode 1, we will be going over getting started with polymer clay. Join me as I go over everything you'll need to get started with polymer clay. Now, if you're newer to clay, there will be a lot of information in this video that you can pull from and start using into your claying. If you're a little more experienced and have worked with clay, there may be a lot of information in here that you're already familiar with. But don't worry, I'm sure there will be some tips in here that you can pull away. So go ahead and join along. Let's get started. Here's a list of items that you will need. Polymer clay, a roller, pasta machine roller or handheld roller, shiny work surface, tile or glass, an oven, rotary tool or sandpaper, drill bits or toothpicks so that you can puncture your hole into the raw clay before baking, and lastly, jewelry findings. Now I want to go over everything that I have here on the table. These are some tools or supplies that you'll need to get started with polymer clay. You won't need everything on here, and I do have more than one of some items just to show you different items that you can use or different options that you have. And the first thing I want to start with are actually these clay rollers. So you're going to need something to roll your clay out with. If you're just starting out, you can start with a roller, and you can also use a pasta machine. There are several people that use pasta machines. I have a pasta machine that has been modified and converted into a clay roller. So I'll do a different video going in depth into the different pasta machines that are available. These are two examples of rollers that you can use. You can honestly use anything that you're comfortable with. This is an acrylic roller. This is one of the rollers that is kind of preferred amongst clay makers because it's so smooth. But I've also noticed that sometimes it can stick to your clay, and this is actually a fondant roller. I purchased this at a craft store, and it's specifically for rolling fondant for cake decorating. And for me, I've noticed that it works really well when I roll my clay out, and I actually prefer it over the acrylic roller sometimes. So we have our rollers, which is one of the things that we'll need to get started with our clay. Next, I want to go on to cutters. You'll need some cutters, and again, everything here isn't something that you absolutely need. If you're going to purchase some cutters to use with your clay, I would suggest starting out with some basic shapes. Circles and squares and half circles can really be used a lot in different types of earring making with polymer clay. Now, if you don't have clay cutters and you want to get started with clay to see if it's something you actually want to do before investing too much money, what you can do is also use a knife to cut out shapes into your clay. I've also seen people use X-Acto knives, which are really sharp and allow a very clean cut for your clay pieces. These are just some examples of cutters that you can find. Next thing I want to talk about is your work surface. So you're going to need something to actually work with your clay and roll it out on. Now I have a couple of different examples here of things that you can use. I prefer to work on glass. This is actually a dry erase board that I got from Target, which is glass. And the reason that I like working with glass is I tend to use a lot of different paints and mixed media when I'm working with my clay, and the cleanest and easiest way to keep my work surface is using clay. If my paint dries on it, I can grab a scraper and scrape it off, and it's very easy to keep glass clean. So this is a very inexpensive option if you're looking for something to work on. This is a glass dry erase board. There are people that also prefer to work right on a piece of tile. So this is a glazed, smooth piece of tile. And what people do, or makers, is they put their piece on here, and especially if they're working on something that's very tedious, that requires a lot of detail work, you can work right on the tile, get close up, and really focus in on your piece. And you don't have to move it onto a different area. You can go ahead and pop the tile right into the oven to bake your piece. Here is another option. This is actually a glass craft working surface. I really like this surface because it has lines on it. And when I'm working on making a slab or something that has, let's say for example, a checkerboard slab where I need to make cuts of my clay that are identical in size, then it really helps to have this grid. Another work surface that some use is just a piece of acrylic. I prefer not using this because of the fact that it can retain a lot of residue. Clay is very oily, so it does leave a lot of residue on your work surface. As you can see, I've already tried cleaning this off and there's still smudging on here. So that is another option for you. Now, I told you that I was going to give you a lot of options for different work surfaces that you can use. If you don't have any of these available to you, then improvise. You can also use a picture frame and just take the glass out. As a matter of fact, I started with a glass piece from a picture frame when I first started claying. And once I realized that it was something that I really enjoyed and liked, then that's when I moved on to purchasing other things. But if you're getting started, I highly suggest that you find something in the home, which could be a picture frame, or even make a trip to your nearest dollar store and buy a picture frame, as long as it has glass. That's a great work surface. So these tissue blades are definitely an item that I suggest you purchase. You can also use a razor blade if you have one, but they're much smaller and not as flexible as the tissue blades. I found these tissue blades, this one here is Sculpey, and I got this at the craft store, but you can also find them, this one I found on Amazon for just a couple dollars. And as you can see, they're very flexible, and that really helps when you're cutting or lifting up your pieces of clay. And they're also great for slicing into canes. So these are some of the typical clays that you'll see in your local craft stores, and I just kind of wanted to go over each one so that you can make your decision on which one to purchase and start out with. So first I want to start with Kato clay. Kato clay is actually very strong and great clay once baked. The only thing that I will give a warning to is that this clay is very firm. And because this clay is very firm, it makes it hard to work with. And when you first open a package of clay, the first thing you want to do is actually work your clay, and this is called conditioning. So when you condition your clay, this is the process of making it soft and workable. And in order to get your clay workable like this, with this clay takes a lot of work. Now that could seem like a bad thing, but there's actually a great spot and time to use this clay. This clay is really good for polymer clay canes. When you make a cane, you want your clay to be very stiff so that the shape doesn't get distorted. So that clay is actually perfect for that. Another clay that is really good for canes is the Fimo Professional clay. It's also a firm clay, so it makes it ideal for polymer clay canes. Now, on the opposite spectrum, Cernit clay is very soft, and I find it almost difficult to use. If you've conditioned it too much, it can actually get a little too soft and become sticky. So this clay may not be a great choice for a beginner, just because it can become kind of difficult to work with when you're conditioning and working with it. But it is a great clay to work with, and the end result is very strong and pretty. So now I want to go on to Fimo Soft. Fimo Soft is a great clay, and as a matter of fact, I use this one often for earrings. It's one of my more, I guess, used clays. I think the clay that I use the absolute most is Sculpey Soufflé, and we will go into that one soon. But the Fimo Soft is very similar to Sculpey Soufflé. The only thing that prevents me from carrying more of this in my craft room is the baking temperature. So one thing you should really pay close attention to with your clays are the baking temperatures. So if you want to mix different types of clays, that's absolutely fine, but you want to pay really close attention to the baking temperature. So Sculpey clays tend to love to be baked at 275 for 30 minutes or so. Fimo is showing that they want 230. and then Kato can go all the way up to 300. So when you mix and combine these, you really want to keep your temperatures in mind, because mixing these, if they require different temperatures, say for example, this is such a low temperature, 230, and then this one at 300, they're just not too compatible if you're trying to mix clays together. Now going on to the Sculpey line of clays. The Sculpey line these are probably my favorite brand of clay is Sculpey. The only clay that I would suggest you not use for your earrings is Sculpey 3. And I like using this clay for embellishments or small details on my earrings, just not the main piece of my earring. So for example, if this was going to be a stud earring, I would not want to make this out of Sculpey 3. And the reason for that is this clay, when baked, is very fragile and brittle. And once it's baked, if it falls or you bend it, it can break. As opposed to this, which is actually Sculpey Soufflé, can bend and will go right back to shape. It's a very strong clay. So this Sculpey 3, beautiful colors, easily available. You'll see it everywhere, but please keep in mind not to make your main pieces of your earrings with it. It is good for details. Now moving on to Sculpey Primo. Sculpey Primo is another one of my favorite clays. So Sculpey Primo and Soufflé are probably the two clays that I use the most. Primo is a great clay. The only thing I will notice, if you're a beginner, I would lean towards Soufflé versus Primo. And the only reason for that is Primo is a tad bit more oily, which means that if you overwork it when you're conditioning it or just working with it in general, it's more likely to have bubbles when you bake it. And it does take some working with to get used to working with it to where you won't have very many bubbles. I'm able to work with it and not get bubbles, but it does take some, it's a learning curve with this clay to not overwork it so that you don't get those bubbles. Now, Sculpey Soufflé, this is my absolute favorite clay. I have tons of this in my craft room. This is mainly what I use for my earrings. This is it here. It is so soft. So once you take it out of the package and you have your brick, you're going to want to start working it and getting it nice and soft and conditioning it, rolling it out with your roller, making sure that the edges are not brittle and cracking. If the edges are cracking or brittle, that just means you need to continue working with your clay, continue conditioning that clay out. So this is Sculpey Soufflé. Like I mentioned, it is my favorite clay to work with. So those are some of the clays that we covered today. I hope you found one that you would like to start or work with. And if you have any more questions on clay, feel free to let me know. Now I want to talk about fingerprints, one of those pesky little annoying things, but we can actually do something about it. When I first started claying, my beautiful pieces would go into the oven and they would come out with my beautiful little fingerprints all over my pieces. And even though I love my fingerprints, I don't know that everyone else would want my fingerprints on their earrings. So let's talk about some things that you can do to prevent fingerprints. So obviously one of the more common things is just to put gloves on, wear gloves. I don't like wearing gloves because my hands tend to get sweaty and I'm just not comfortable working with gloves. So if you're like me, one of the things you can do is actually purchase finger condoms. You can buy these in bulk. I bought these on Amazon. Usually what I tend to do is I wear about 2 or 3. I'll usually wear these 2 fingers here, or sometimes I will wear these 3. And then I can work with my clay without having to worry about getting fingerprints on them. So just as an example, I'm going to squish my clay, try to flatten it down, and then I'm going to squish it with my finger condom. And as you can see, the side that I squished over here is covered in fingerprints, and this side over here is not because of the glove. So if you're really struggling with fingerprints, that's something you can do, is just wear finger condoms or gloves while you're working with your clay. Another great tip for not getting fingerprints on your clay is actually some good old-fashioned cornstarch. So I'm going to show you what I want to do. Is I'm actually going to lightly dust one side with cornstarch, and you don't need a lot, just a little bit to make it not sticky. I'm putting the same amount of pressure on both sides. And while you still see an indent, it's so much more smooth than this side where you can actually see the fingerprint. So cornstarch is nice to just lightly dust your clay with before you start working with it, and then you don't have to worry about all of those pesky fingerprints. Now, I did go ahead and bake a piece of clay, and I intentionally put my beautiful fingerprint in it. And if that happens, there is an easy way to get that fingerprint off. All you're going to need is some acetone. So you're going to want some 100% acetone and Q-tips. And what we're going to do is actually just rub out the fingerprint. So I'm wetting my cotton ball, my cotton Q-tip, and then I'm just dabbing it on and rubbing out the fingerprint. This is also great if you have any hair or lint. And there we go. So the fingerprints are all gone. And I also wanted to show you that acetone can remove hairs from clay. So there is a hair I purposely baked into this piece of clay. And all we are going to do is dip our cotton bud in some acetone, and there goes the hair. That easy. So that's a really cool tip that I really enjoy using a lot, and I hope it helps you too. Now I want to show you how to roll out your clay. You're going to take some clay. I'm actually using some Sculpey Soufflé, and I'm not going to use much, just enough to kind of show you how to work with your clay and get it ready for using with your cutters and then putting into your oven. So this is our piece of clay. Typically I would have conditioned it by rolling it through my pasta machine, but I really want to show you how to do this without a pasta machine for the people that don't have access to one or that are just getting started. So what I like to do is first roll it out and then fold it over and roll again. When you're rolling your clay, you do want to make sure that your fold is on the top when you're rolling it so that the air can flow out. If you roll your clay this way, then that pocket in there will hold air, and when you bake your clay, that air will be trapped and turn into bubbles. So this clay doesn't need very much conditioning. As you can see, it's pretty much ready to go. Depending on how thick you want your clay, there are different ways to make sure that your clay is nice, even, and consistent. So one of the more basic, easy ways to do this is using popsicle sticks. You can place a popsicle stick on either side of your clay, and that's the thickness that your clay will end up. If you want your clay a little thicker, then you can line up 2 popsicle sticks and then roll them that way. So we're just going to use 2 popsicle sticks, and then we're just going to roll our clay until we are pushing down on the popsicle sticks and can no longer push down on our clay. So now I have my piece of clay that is nice and smooth and flat and ready to be worked with. So what I can do from this point is take my cutter, if you're using cutters, and go ahead and use it on your clay. So once you've used your cutter, you should have a shape like this. And when you pull your clay back, your clay piece should be left behind. Now the reason my clay actually stuck to my surface is because I'm using a shiny surface. So you can use something like this, a tile or glass, ceramic tile, anything that's smooth and shiny surface for the clay to stick to. I wouldn't suggest cutting or rolling your clay on parchment paper because the clay won't stick to it. And if you go to cut your clay on parchment paper, then the clay will just end up getting stuck in your cutter. All right, so that's the piece that we have now. And in order to get it into the oven, we actually need to transfer our clay piece. And I like to bake on a piece of tile. But in order to get my pieces on my tile, we have to pick the clay up off of this tile. And the easiest way to do that is with our tissue blade. Now there are ways to do it correctly and ways that will distort your piece. So the last thing you want to do is have a really pretty piece with all your details and pretty slab work, and you go to pick it up and you bend it and mess it all up. The easiest way is to put your tissue blade down at an angle. You don't want to go flat. You want to go at an angle, and you just want to go left and right, and that'll give you your piece. And you shouldn't have any bending. Now, before you put it in the oven, I do like to, if you have any excess, bend it down and kind of just shape it away. This will really help in the next step once the pieces come out and we go to sand. So I like to bake on a piece of copy paper. I'll place my clay on copy paper, and then I'll place this copy paper on top of my tile, which goes into the oven. So I'm going to go ahead and bake this piece, and when it comes out, we'll go ahead and sand it together. Okay, so here's our piece fresh out of the oven. It's still warm. You can start to sand your piece as soon as it cools. So what I like to do in order to speed up that process, because I'm usually making several earrings at a time, is actually drop my piece into some water and let it quickly cool off. So once our piece has cooled off, it should cool off pretty quickly. You can just put your finger in and check to make sure it's nice and cool. So this piece has cooled off, and I'm just going to dry it off a bit so that I can start to sand. Now I do want to show you the pieces where I will be sanding. You can see there's a little bit of a jagged edge there, some jaggedness here, not really too much, but sanding those pieces off is what will make your piece look very professional. What I like to use for sanding is actually a rotary tool. And on the tip of my rotary tool is a buffing wheel. This is a felt buffing wheel, and you can find them on Amazon. And there's a special attachment on this rotary tool that allows me to put those buffing wheels on there. I'm just going to move the water out of the way and show you how I use this rotary tool. If you don't have a rotary tool, you can also use sanding paper. And I suggest wet sanding with clay, because sanding paper does cause clay to turn white. So if you're working with black clay or a deep colored clay and you sand it, you may start seeing some white residue pop up. So sanding wheel, very easy. You're just gonna move it up and down, and you'll see all the little pieces just flying off. You do want to be careful when you're sanding, because since these little pieces go flying off, you want to make sure that they don't go into your eye. And you can take it and run it along the back of your piece if you have any. I folded over the pieces before I baked my piece, I folded them towards the back. So now what I'm doing is I'm kind of just sanding those little pieces away, and I'm very, very gently using this sander. Hardly no pressure on my behalf, on my part. I'm literally just letting it do its thing. So once I'm happy with how my piece is, which I'm almost there, so now I'm pretty happy with how this piece turned out. The back is nice and smooth and flat. the front is just as good. So I'm pretty happy overall with how this piece is sanded. From here, what we would do is be able to put our hole in our piece. I like to put my hole in my piece after I've baked it. It does look a little more professional. But what I'm going to use is actually a different rotary tool. And I got this rotary tool on Amazon. It was very inexpensive. I believe it was about $16 or $17. And I have a drill bit attachment on it. And what I do is I drill my holes into my pieces using my drill. Now let's talk about placing the hole on your piece. I really want to talk about this because I feel like we all make the same mistakes when we first start claying. I was really worried that my clay pieces would break, and so I was tending to put my hole lower or away from the edges, thinking that it would make it stronger, which it does make it stronger, but then you'll have to use a very large jump ring. So what you actually want to do is place your hole a little closer to the edge. And the clay is so light, you really don't need to move down and make this very strong. So placing the hole right along the edge should be just fine. Now I'm going to go ahead and make my hole, and I'm just going to fold over some tissue to drill my hole. Typically I would have a workstation where I'm drilling, and I can show more on that later, but for now I'm just going to quickly show you how I use my drill to make a hole. And you can see how perfect that hole is. That's about it for today's video. Thank you for joining in. I hope you found it useful and helpful to your clay journey.